This is our third Encompass Mental Health and Communication series. And I am Louise Hansen, and on behalf of the Encompas team, it is my pleasure to introduce Françoise Mathieu, who is a stress and trauma specialist. Françoise is a registered psychotherapist with expertise in stress, trauma, and compassion fatigue. She is also the executive director and co-founder of TEND, whose aim is to offer consulting and training to helping professionals on topics such as secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, self-care, wellness, and organizational health. She is a sought-after speaker in this field and works with helping professionals across the spectrum, including those in the policing world. She has worked with the LAPD Homicide and Peer Support Divisions, the Los Angeles County Probation Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force, Edmonton Police, West Fargo PD, Cleveland PD, and the OPP. We met Françoise while looking to secure evidence-based and evidence-informed resources for our recently launched Encompass Members Portal. And we are really pleased to be offering some of the TEND resources within the portal resources library. That resources library will be released within the portal by the end of next month. However, as of next week, you will be able to access them if you reach out to the Encompass Care Management team. Now, today, Françoise will share a bit about her experience, her expertise, and the reasons that she and her team have created these resources, and most importantly, the benefits to you in your wellness journey. We are really thrilled to have her here with us today. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping points. We have purposely disabled cameras and microphones so that everyone can participate anonymously. We will record this presentation and post it on the Encompass site for those to access it who may have not been able to attend today. And we will stop recording once we begin with the questions and answers. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation, and you can submit those directly through the Q&A feature in the platform. Those questions will only come to the Encompass team, and we will read them out to Françoise to ensure anonymity. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Françoise. Welcome, Françoise.
Thank you so much. You can hear me? We're good? Excellent.
Good.
Some of you notice my camera's jumping a little bit. It's fine. My internet's really strong. My camera's being a little quirky, but that's just a reality. I'm so happy to be with you all. Welcome. And I hope that you'll find this presentation useful. And as Louise mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'll aim to answer as many questions as we can. And of course, if we run out of time, Louise's group will be happy to address those a little bit later. So let's jump right in. It's 10 o'clock. I'm in Kingston, Ontario right now in lockdown, like many people. And I've been in this room for 400 days. I'm being a bit dramatic. I have been outside, of course, but I wanted to share with you today some of the work that my company has been doing for the past 2 decades with both uniformed civilian members of law enforcement, the military, corrections, and also we work with reservists and we work with members, civilian and uniform, who are retired at this point. So I wanted to share with you best practice methods, what has worked, what hasn't, and a little bit about all of that. So before I launch in, I wanted to briefly mention some of the folks we've been working with recently and what we have found has been helpful for them, and see whether it lands for you as well. So as Louise mentioned, we've had the pleasure of working with many different groups in law enforcement. My background is mental health. So I'm a civilian mental health professional, and my expertise very quickly became trauma and complex work environments. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a few minutes. We've been doing some work recently with the OPP 911 communicators, particularly the bilingual folks in the northern region. So a shout out to them. If some of you are listening, we did that a few months ago. It was a real pleasure. And before the pandemic hit, I was doing a lot of work in Los Angeles, particularly with LAPD, and I'll go back to that in a minute. But also, I do a lot of work in anti-human trafficking and child internet exploitation. So a lot of pretty intense, heavy content, as you can imagine. And because that's the area of expertise that I have, I personally became really interested in best practice strategies to stay well. So this was not just an altruistic kind of quest on my part. I was really interested in finding ways to stay well so that I could remain, in a healthy relationship with my families and friends. I certainly learned the hard way that when you do and are working on heavy cases, sometimes we take it home with us. So I wanted to learn those strategies myself because I hadn't actually received a lot of training in that topic 25 years ago when I did my master's degree. And this became basically my quest and the work that I do every single day. And I absolutely love doing this work. So the couple of folks I wanted to mention, and you're going to see, I'm going to tie in a couple of stories from my work in the military as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. But most recently, we've had the pleasure of working with West Fargo PD and the Cass County Sheriff's Office in North Dakota. And as I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work with LAPD as well, particularly in the homicide division, but also peer support division, working again with both sworn and civilian officers. And the reason I'm presenting to you the contrast between these two folks, or these two organizations, is, as I'm sure you know, if you've ever watched the movies Fargo, North Dakota is an extremely rural environment. So they have very large catchment areas, a lot of travel, but they also don't have that anonymity. So obviously, if you work in small communities in North Dakota, you are also serving the communities that you live in. And that can present a series of obstacles in terms of mental health resources, right? The lack of anonymity. And the same is true in Kingston. If any of you have lived or worked in the Kingston area, it's pretty big city, 120,000, a little bit bigger if you go to the outskirts of town. But one of the barriers before we started doing a lot of mental health resources on Zoom or online is that a lot of my folks were really hesitant to come and seek support from me in my private practice because they didn't want to be seen, right? So there was an idea about anonymity and confidentiality, which of course is not as much an issue when you're working in Los Angeles. So it's been really interesting to work with more rural environments, but also large urban areas. And I've learned so much from them as well. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is for 10 years, I worked as a civilian for the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly with the Kingston base. And as many of you know, we have a large military base in Kingston, and we also have lots of prisons, and I'll go back to that in a minute. And the work that I was doing was helping civilians, active duty members, reservists, and retirees, and particularly supporting folks who were coming back from active combat, dealing with PTSD, re-entry, family liaison support, and everything that goes with that. So I learned a lot through that. So it was actually a really interesting contract. I was very reluctant to give it up, but I had to stop because I was traveling too much and it just didn't feel like the ethical thing to do, to continue having a private practice when I was traveling all over North America giving training. But I learned a lot about the reality of, first of all, being a civilian in the armed forces. What is that experience like? And what is it like to retire and go from being an active duty member to then being, a veteran? What is it like to work in these environments? So kind of that whole spectrum of resources and challenges. But the other thing that I learned really quickly, so you can tell I'm French Canadian probably based on my accent or how fast I'm talking. But when I moved to this province 25, 26 years ago, I started realizing we also had very limited mental health resources. It's getting a little bit better, but as we all know, there are still lots of barriers to accessing services. And one of the challenges I found for me, morally and ethically, is that I was working with they were wonderful members, but I didn't always have enough resources to send them towards. And that was a big kind of challenge in the work that I've done, continually looking at the barriers towards accessing care. So I want to share a little story. This is a picture I took a couple of weeks ago. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure. It's the Kingston Penitentiary. And if you're familiar with Kingston, you know that we are the prison capital of Canada. And so we have the whole kind of industry around, particularly the federal correctional system. And this prison is just 2 blocks from my house. And years ago, when I first moved to Kingston, I volunteered in the Kingston Penitentiary. I was originally born in northern Quebec. My parents were teachers in the high Arctic. And so I had this pretty strong affinity with Indigenous folks and particularly Indigenous lifers. So I was working in there as a volunteer with a group that at the time was called the First Nations Lifers. They were a group of people who were there for extended periods of time. And one of the things I started noticing really quickly, and this is 25 years ago, so I'm not actually trained at that point, I'm much more of a naive enthusiast, if you will, is I started noticing that there were some folks who worked in the prison system who were really, really burnt out, and some people who were not. And I became interested in exploring why that was, because there was no correlation, interestingly, between years of service and provider impairment, as we call it. So you could easily, and I'm sure you've seen this in policing as well, that sometimes the rookies had higher rates of emotional distress and or burnout than people who'd been there for a really long time. There's actually some really interesting research around that. For example, there's some study that came out looking at physicians, looking at child protection workers, looking at nurses and teachers. And interestingly, there are different peaks and valleys where the peaks of higher rates of burnout. And in certain professions, it's actually early on in people's career. So kind of at the 3 to 5 year mark, we see higher rates of distress. Then there's a kind of a natural attrition where obviously some people self-select out. As I'm sure you know, what was interesting working in the prison system is a lot of people who became correctional officers were often former police or military veterans. So we're often talking about the same kind of population. And I became also interested in what is called career sustaining behaviors. So how do people sustain their well-being in spite of working in really complex, really hard to change environments? And I'm sure you'll agree with me that policing, the military, and the correctional services in Canada are giant entities. And one of the pieces I also found is when I was doing a lot of support and counseling with my military folks and my law enforcement folks, was for them to recognize that there were certain things that they had no control over. We don't necessarily have control over big system decisions. We don't necessarily have control over who we immediately report to. We don't necessarily have control over what the community thinks about us, how we're portrayed in the media. We also don't necessarily have control over if we're civilians working in law enforcement. Sometimes we're often invisible. How do people feel about the work that we do? And yet, the reason I'm still doing this work after 25 years was not because of all the barriers I saw. It was the opposite. It was starting to see that there was still a way to stay well in these really high stress, high trauma exposed environments. And so those are the resources that we're inviting you to take part in terms of and I'll mention a couple of programs or the 3 programs that we're sharing with you at this time. But I became really interested in what are called career sustaining behaviors. So there's actually a lot of research on career sustaining behaviors. And what I started doing is interviewing people who had been perhaps in law enforcement or military or corrections for 25 years or 20 years. And those who were well, I basically interviewed them and I said, basically, tell me everything. How are you still well in spite of all of these challenges? And that's something I continue to do regularly. Anytime I have a chance to meet someone, if I'm doing a ride along, if I'm having individual conversations with people, particularly in law enforcement, I basically want to collect all that data. What allows us to stay well in spite of having very little control over so many factors? So I wanted to today, I'm not known for my brevity, as you can probably tell at this point, but I wanted to offer you a little overview of the 310 programs that are going to be offered through Encompas, as Louise mentioned, towards the end of May, but earlier if you are a member, and you can contact your case manager. But basically, I want to tell you what's going to be in there and why I want to encourage you to consider using these resources. So first of all, we hear a lot of barriers to using tools for mental well-being. I don't know about you, but the pandemic has been so interesting in terms of receiving self-care resources. I have a friend who said it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. You know, we are bombarded with resources, 7 tips to stay well. And some of them are great. Some of them we have no time or energy for, and some of them don't necessarily land with us. So that's not what we wanted to do here. We really wanted to address what are the obstacles, what are the barriers people are naming in terms of using strategies, and how can we address that? So the first barrier, a lot of people said to me, if I had $1 for every time someone said to me, there is no time. And I agree with you, right? Our workloads are busy. We are juggling a lot of different things. And so what I want to invite you to look at is to recognize that the strategies we're recommending are super quick. These are 2 to 3 minute strategies. We have found them to be really useful. As I mentioned before, I was working with 911 communicators. They were talking about 30-second strategies they can use because, of course, they have a very high volume of calls. We're working with hospitals right now. We're currently involved supporting people in the COVID units. As we know, these folks don't have time. However, they still have to wash their hands and they still have to take their PPE on and off. Those are moments that you can use to reset yourself. And so these are really great, tiny, we call them micro strategies. So yes, we know nobody has time, and that's okay. The second thing, this slide was actually gifted to me by the LAPD, and it was a little bit of a skepticism about, and I think there's more of an openness now where, you know, folks who work in law enforcement, civilian or uniform, are more open to these notions about mindfulness and, you know, kind of all these different practices that are being found to be useful. But I had a healthy level of pushback a few years ago where people said, first of all, I don't know what that's about. I don't want to sit on a cushion. I'm not going to meditate. And they sent me this slide saying, come on, inner peace. I don't have all day, which I can totally relate to. I'm not someone who's going to spend 40 minutes meditating. That's not in my personality or my coping style. However, I can absolutely do 30 seconds and I can definitely go for a walk while listening to a non-trauma podcast. So I took this photo a couple of years ago. You're going to see that it's basically a little packet that was given to my friends in the Canadian Forces. And you see on there, it says tactical breathing, and it just basically walks people through a really simple breathing exercise. And I thought this was so great because this is a really clever marketing strategy. It's just a rebranding of a mindfulness or a meditation activity. And if it works to call it tactical breathing, go for it. A couple of years ago, I was back down in LA working with a group of reservists. So they are basically military reservists, and they also are active duty in the LAPD. And there was a presentation before mine from a dietitian, and it was called Tactical Nutrition. It was just healthy eating. But if you want to call it tactical breathing and it's more popular that way, that's totally fine. In the military, we also found that folks would call it combat breathing. And the fact is that these very small strategies can really help us before, during, and after, you know, really highly charged environments. So I believe in these strategies. And if you want to call it tactical and that makes you more prone to do them or use them, go for it. Some of the other tools that we found in terms of using strategies were just not enough time in terms of increased volume and complexity of work. I don't think I need to talk to you about the impact of the pandemic. You're living it as well. But we certainly have found this year that people are either underworked, underemployed. If you have friends or family who are not in these fields, I have a brother who used to work for Cirque du Soleil. As you can imagine, he is underemployed. And the rest of us, we have found that the volume of work has just increased hugely. And many of us are working actually longer hours than ever before. So these are really chaotic times, as we all know. And in addition to that, we found that a lot of you were saying that you had increased demands in your personal lives. So we're all in the same province right now. Schools are closed. How are we juggling our work duties and multitasking? Some of you are working from home. Some of you are not. How is that all going? Do you have childcare? You know, kind of the full catastrophe of life right now. And some of us, of course, have additional concerns in terms of caregiver needs. I mean, this is a really amplified situation for everybody right now. We need to recognize that as well. If you're interested in more micro skills, we have a whole bunch of free resources on our webpage. Excuse me, it's just the COVID-19 button. And we really designed them, again, to be really quick, actionable. So those are the tools on the right. And on the left, you'll see a whole bunch of articles that I've written over the year. And one of them is really aimed at leadership. And it's called This is a Marathon, Not a Sprint. And it came out of my reflection a year or so ago, that a lot of leaders I was working with were incredibly concerned about the well-being of their folks, but they were acting as if this was a 2-week ice storm. If some of you remember the great ice storm of 1998, I'm probably dating myself. But, you know, in the ice storm of 1998, when I had a 2-week-old baby, we kind of ran this as if it was, which it was, a 2 to 3 week situation. This isn't that kind of situation. And we're trying to really encourage all of us to find ways to pace ourselves because we have so many moving parts, uncertainty, unpredictability. And we need to understand how basically problem solving is really impacted by wear and tear. And we know that from the military, when we look at the results of the creation of this operational stress injury model, it wasn't just looking at PTSD, it was also looking at moral injury. How do we feel, ethically? It was really looking at wear and tear, just understanding fatigue. And it was also looking at the need to grieve, whether it's a big grief or kind of losing rituals or even time to spend together. So what we believe in, and this is anchored in neuroscience, are what we call micro practices, as I mentioned earlier. And micro practices, the recommendation is small and often. If you go to my website, you'll see I wrote an article a few years ago. It's called something like Breathe, Reset, Refuel, something like that. And it came as a result of someone asking us, what is a recommended daily amount of self-care? Which I thought was actually a really great question. But the answer was the following. Self-care is not just, white knuckling it through a week and collapsing on your couch on Friday night and watching 7 hours of whatever on Netflix until the sign comes up that says, are you still watching? Self-care is not necessarily crashing for a weekend and calling that self-care. That's something else. That's a shutdown, right? Which can be helpful or unhealthy, depending. What we're interested in are small and often strategies that you can use throughout your day. So as I said earlier, my 911 folks who said, I found actually these 15 seconds where I can reset myself in between calls. And what the literature has shown is that, of course, holidays are great. And of course, having a chance to refuel are important. But what matters most actually are daily rituals that you can use. One of them, of course, is sleep. And working with the LAPD, the last time I was there, I was the only person in the room who had had more than 7 hours of sleep. In fact, I was the only person in the room who'd had more than 6 hours of sleep the night prior. And we know that, of course, those daily practices make a difference when we can as well. So let's take a look at the 3 programs being offered through Encompas. And I'll talk a little bit about my dear colleague, Diana Tickes, in a minute, who was instrumental in developing these. So the first thing you'll have access to is a course called Compassion Fatigue 101. And it is basically a 90-minute program you can use at your own pace. And through it, I will lead you through a little bit of an explanation and definition of terminology. And the terminology, understanding it only matters so that the more we understand it, the more we can assess, what's going on for us and what we can do. You're also going to see some assessment tools that are really quick and easy to use. And we'll talk about a couple of other strategies as well. So the way we kind of look at the warning signs and looking at your own risk and resiliency factor is what we call the Venn diagram. We go through every element. In the interest of time, I won't do it now, but you can access it through the CF 101 course, and it helps you assess what are your risk and resiliency factors in your personal life, what's going on for you right now, in terms of grief and loss, if that's a factor, in terms of direct exposure to trauma, whether that's physical or verbal violence, for example, being a direct witness to something like a crime scene. The secondary trauma piece is about being exposed through it vicariously, perhaps people debriefing with each other, looking at crime scene photos, hearing difficult content, whether you're civilian or uniform. And then we kind of go through looking at compassion fatigue, understanding what that looks like, how can you address it, how can we address the challenges of our working environment, and looking at just wear and tear, workload, and other factors that are going on. One of the pieces that we have found is the most robust of this course is identifying your own warning signs. So I don't know about you and how long you've been in the field, but I know that my warning signs have always been the same. I identified them 20 years ago. My loved ones can absolutely tell you, they know that when I come home with a clipboard and a whistle and I become a drill sergeant, I have a tiny, window of tolerance. I have a shorter wick. And what's been helpful is to be able to identify that, but also let them know how can they help. So what I need is a transition ritual. I like to be able to change, perhaps do the dishes, just kind of land a little bit. But if you live with other people and they don't know that about you, they could also take that very personally and feel like you've gone off duty from your family life, if that makes sense. I also did that as an aside with my family and friends, where Maybe you love talking on the phone after work. I have no bandwidth for that because I'm on Zoom all day these days. And so trying to explain to folks also, right, what you need. And if you're someone who's more of an extrovert, how can you reach out to other people at this time? We found the same was really important at work, whether you're working in person or virtually. If some of you are people who actually need someone else to reach out, how do you let people know about that? And conversely, if you're someone, I'm an introvert, so when I'm stressed, I like to be by myself. It's nothing personal, nothing against anybody else. But what we started seeing is sometimes there were miscommunications or workplace friction where some people were thinking, well, what's his problem? Or why is she not coming for our walk? Or why is she not, taking part in some of the fun banter that we have that kind of helps, break the ice or deal with the stress. And so being able to explain that to your colleagues can help also lots of miscommunications in that way. You'll see also we have probably our most popular tool is called low impact debriefing. These low impact debriefing postcards are available, by the way. They're totally free. You can download them, share them with anyone you want. And in fact, the West Fargo police actually created a water bottle with these strategies to remind themselves about it. And it basically invites us all to think about, there's a big difference, I'm sure you'll agree, with sliming people around us with graphic, horrendous details of whatever we've just kind of worked on and asking for permission. And I know that in law enforcement and in the first responder community, I get a lot of pushback about this. People say, well, we're immune to it. This is how we, kind of deal with dark humor as a way to relieve stress. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you about how what we find is that even if you feel that you're pretty immune to those things because you've been around for a while, it can actually have a cumulative effect. And we also want to invite all of us to think about how do those stories impact other people around us. And you'll see in the webinar that I talk extensively about that. We also lead you through the ProQual. The ProQual is a free test to assess 3 things. When you take the test, you will get your level of secondary trauma. So how are stories impacting you? Indirect stories that you hear. Burnout has to do with your working conditions, your hours, your pay, your rewards, your recognition. So what is your level of burnout at this time? And the final thing it measures, which I think is really interesting, is called compassion satisfaction. Compassion satisfaction refers to the rewards of the job. So remember at the beginning, I talked about career sustaining behaviors. What we've discovered is there are some things that are the reason why we keep going. And I don't just mean our pension. I mean, what are the things where we think, this is why I do this work? The once in a while connection, the shift we see in somebody, particularly if you're involved in community outreach, for example. As an aside, if you're interested in this test, but you're not a big fan of the pencil and paper test, if you look on your app store, there is a free version of this test. It's called Provider Resilience, and it was designed by the US military. So it's just called the Provider Resilience app, and you can get this test totally free and simply take it whenever you want. We recommend taking it every 3 to 6 months. The second program you're being offered, and I'm so thrilled that you can have access to this. And I want to tell you a little bit why this is such a wonderful tool, particularly for folks who work in the law enforcement field or in community. This was designed, it's called Staying Grounded in Stressful Work, Window of Tolerance Framework, Strategies to Keep Helping Professionals Grounded and Centered. It was developed by our team member called Diana Tickets. Diana is a social worker. She's worked in very high stress, high trauma work environments for many, many years. She is still actively working. Even today, right now, she's working in COVID units with healthcare workers. She also has been involved and worked in the court system, accompanying people. So she was basically working in an emergency ward with the sexual assault nurses, people who were doing the rape kits, people who were supporting victims of crime. She was part of the Unfounded Police Review. She's worked very close at hand with various police forces. And she was really interested in developing resources for all of us before, during, and after we are exposed to particularly difficult, traumatic, and or caustic material. So Staying Grounded is all tools to help you very concretely develop strategies to reset yourself, and it's all anchored in neuroscience. One of the things that Diana emphasizes in her course is the importance of pausing. And what I mean by that, I'm sure you've all at some point been on social media and thought to yourself, probably thought to yourself, that person should have really taken a breath before they wrote whatever they wrote. And I'm always reminded of that when I look at social media, for example, but also in our day-to-day kind of interactions with each other. And a very famous neuroscientist and mental health professional, and also Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl, wrote many years ago the following. He said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And this is true, by the way, even in tactical situations. So if you're a uniform member and you've been involved in tactical, we know that tactical responses, we do them better when we've had a lot of training. And we know also that people who are very experienced, they actually have a baseline where their blood, kind of their blood pressure lowers when they're concentrated, because it helps them stay calm. And when we're calm, we have better reactions and actions as well. But it's also true, obviously, for civilian members. I don't know about you, if you've ever received a very dysregulated / angry phone call, message, email, whether that's from the community or from someone that you live with or a colleague. And what we know is that the more we can learn to pause, and what I mean by pause is just 10 seconds to kind of think about our response, it can actually lead to much better outcomes for ourselves and the people that we interact with. The other piece that we found in our neuroscience research is that a 20-second pause after these tiny practices, so even if this is a 3-minute breathing activity, if you take 20 seconds after, what it actually does is it allows it to become wired in your brain. So many of you are familiar with the saying, the brain that fires together wires together. And we know that the reason, for example, things like mindfulness works is that the more we do these practices, the more they actually become embedded in our brain as kind of the obvious response that we have to stressful events. So 20-second pauses make a really big difference as well. You'll see in this course that Diana goes through all sorts of strategies to reset. And resetting, I mean, I think a lot of us know about the need to reset after we've been involved in something, really intense. And a lot of us will reset through perhaps exercising or ranting at someone or, punching the wall. Like we kind of have this excess energy, but we are recommending strategies that make a big difference after. And what we've also found is there are ways to prepare before, if you know that it's coming, during the event, and also after. And Diana developed a lot of this, as I said, both by going and helping people in court, but also in her own work as a therapist working with people who'd experienced pretty significant trauma. A couple of other things to invite you to think about is, what is your transition from work to home? So those of you who never left the workplace or are working out in the field, I'm sure you have a ritual for coming home, whether it's taking off, your work clothes or, some type of way to land. And some of you actually are aware of these transitions. And for some of us, we're not even aware of them, but when we no longer do them, we really find a difference. I have a friend, for example, who used to walk from work. She was a crisis counselor, and she used to walk from work to home, and then she got injured and she couldn't walk anymore. So she lost that 30-minute buffer, and she realized that she was coming home in a taxi, for example, after 30 seconds. Kingston's not that big. And she was much more irritable with her loved ones. If some of you are working from home, well, we don't have those transition rituals, right? So currently my buffer is this door, and my commute is 5 seconds. It's when I open the door to the demands of whoever's on the other side of the door. So kind of thinking about those as well. The other piece that Diana talks about, which, no word of a lie, the window of tolerance, understanding it has absolutely changed my career. I don't even have enough time in this short period of time we have together to explain how this changed my career. But the brief version is, and if you're familiar with the window of tolerance, you'll know that what it looks at is, for us individually, but also our colleagues, our loved ones, and the people that we serve, we all have an optimum arousal zone, right? So that's basically being in the zone. We all know what that looks like. When I feel calm, I feel focused. And we also know when we go into what we call hyperarousal. Hyperarousal is, Diana calls it flipping your lid. So if you've ever been stuck in traffic, or you've ever spilled milk all inside your fridge into the vegetable crisper, you know what I mean? I'm sure you'll agree with me that there are times where we are so close to tapping out. Like this is the final straw. We have road rage. We rip the door off the fridge. You're just like, right? Then we call that flipping your lid. I saw that a lot with soldiers coming back from combat, of course. But I think what we don't talk about enough are two other things. I don't think we talk enough about hypoarousal. Hypoarousal is lying in the puddle of milk and just having no momentum or energy to do anything. We know, of course, that hypoarousal at times can be related to depression or symptoms of depression or perhaps other health issues, but sometimes it's also just becomes a way of life. And for some folks who have a lot of complex historical trauma, for example, some of the challenging citizens that sometimes you might interact with, that might have actually been a really adaptive coping mechanism at the time, but it can lead to under responding to certain things. The final thing I love about the window of tolerance is that that window of optimal arousal zone can actually be widened. It can be widened by a variety of things. So some of us have a wider sweet spot, right? We are just more calm, personality-wise, disposition, life circumstances than other people. An example I could give you, for example, are members of my family. So there are two members of my family who have severe ADHD, attention deficit disorder. They will openly say they have a much shorter wick than I do because I don't have ADHD. What I also found, and I invite you to think about this for yourself, is there are some things that widen my window that allow me to cope with whatever's coming my way. For me personally, it's sleep. For my partner, it's exercise, right? So thinking about these pieces, and you'll see that Diana leads you through this exploration. And I cannot say enough about this tool. I use it all the time. So Diana, in this course, we'll talk about a whole bunch of pieces, but it's not an academic presentation. It is really aimed at concrete tools that you can use immediately. So I really invite you to consider checking that out. The final program that we're so thrilled to share with you is called our Psychological PPE program. It was launched in November, and there are monthly micro skills to protect your mental health. So when you access the portal, you will see that you have access to basically 1 year, you get a 1-year membership, and you'll have access to everything from the start. So when we started in November, up until however long you continue using the program. And basically it was designed for everyone who's involved in what we call high touch professions. So that could be anyone who's civilian uniformed in healthcare, law enforcement, education, child protection, first responders, you name it. And it was created by myself and two of my colleagues, Diana, who I've already introduced to you, and Dr. Jennifer Russell, who is a psychiatrist in Vancouver. And every month you'll see that what we do is we have a discussion about a particular topic. We demonstrate a really concrete skill. We answer questions you may have, so you can submit them through the portal, and we have a whole bunch of additional resources. So we've already talked recently, our last month was about brain fog, which I'm sure some of you have experienced, I certainly have. Another month was about how to create a community of support. Another month was boundaries. We had a good conversation about stigma. I really encourage you, particularly those of you, all of you who are listening to this, who are involved in the law enforcement community. The stigma piece was really aimed at looking at some of the barriers to seeking help. And in there, we interview a military person who was in Rwanda and kind of talked about his own experience of stigma. And we started by offering you some strategies, how to take stock and take a pause. So we're very proud of this product and this program, and I hope that you enjoyed as well.